Ladies, gentlemen, and beasts, I have seen over 100 horror movies this year, and I'm going to talk about all of those at the end of the year, but for now, I want to focus on some short recommendations of hidden gem films. Let's get into it. New Life tells the story about two women, a fugitive and the special agent who's chasing her down. At the beginning of the movie, it's very unclear why any of this is happening, and finding that out is part of the fun here. The brilliance of New Life is that the characters themselves actually don't know a whole lot either, so it doesn't feel like the audience is kept in the dark for artificial tension. This is something I think about when stories like this rely very heavily on flashbacks. You know, if I would even be interested if it was told chronologically. And I think I would be here. The film shows horror from different angles. One of them is what we usually see in these types of movies, where an unsuspecting character gets caught up in an impossible situation. The other perspective is from the person who's tasked with cleaning it all up. There is a bad guy in this movie, but they're not shown. I was going to call them a faceless puppet master, but in this scenario, they've lost control over their puppets. Awful, immoral decisions are made by characters actually shown in the film, but it's never a black or white thing. There's nuance here, and I think that's what I most appreciated about the film. I don't think your mind is going to be completely blown by the reveal in this film, and that's not why I'm being vague about it. You're probably going to get halfway through the film, and you're probably going to say, oh, I understand what type of movie this is, because it does fall into a very specific category of horror. For me, though, getting to that point was one of the coolest film experiences I've had all year. Frogman is the one film I can't shut up about this year. I find it so incredibly delightful. In my opinion, it's been a pretty rough year for found footage, to the point where this is probably the only movie in that subcategory that I would wholeheartedly recommend this year. Don't get me wrong, I will watch every VHS movie that comes out until they stop making them or I drop dead, but I've seen a lot of these movies now, and it's difficult for them to stand out amongst the pack. After hitting play on Frogman, I recognized some very well-worn found footage tropes in the opening minutes, to the point where I was kind of thinking this movie wasn't going to be for me, but then it hit me. They're doing all this on purpose. Frogman is a satire that sometimes borders on being a straight-up spoof film. It's hilarious. The plot is essentially the Blair Witch Project, but with Frogman. And if you're confused about what Frogman is, it's a cryptid. He's a frog and a man. Does that sound like something that would be funny to you? Are you a sicko like me whose TikTok algorithm is just Mothman content? If the answers to these questions are yes, I would recommend you check it out. Frogman fucks. What You Wish For stressed me out. Nick Stahl plays a chef with a nasty gambling debt who decides to get out of the country to see one of his old friends. You quickly find out that they studied culinary together, yet their current lives couldn't be more different. It's a classic setup. Nick Stahl's character needs an escape and immediately sees an opportunity to work with his old friend. But obviously, when you think about it, it's kind of suspicious that his old friend just cut all ties, moved to a different country, and became super rich. And let's just say from there on out, trouble ensues. After the initial setup, every situation feels like it's an inch away from complete disaster, and the stakes are raised pretty consistently throughout the film. The third act straight up feels like a Hitman level, where the main character is having to wear many different hats depending on who he's speaking to. And like the Hitman games, there's an absurdist comedy to it all here, because all of these situations are really bizarre. I could see someone labeling this one as more of a thriller, but I think it has plenty of horror movie shit happening around the main character to warrant it a place on this list. Mads really surprised me. Not because I thought I was going to hate it or anything. Zombie movies are very much in my wheelhouse, but the whole we shot this movie in one take gimmick feels a little played out to me. After the, admittedly, very cool opening scene, I couldn't really see the point as to why they were sticking with that formula, but then when things really got going, my mind was completely changed regarding this. You can think of this one as 28 Days Later meets Gaspar Noé's Climax. It's a 90-minute snapshot of a drug-fueled apocalypse. The zombies are drawn to light, which is represented visually by a psychedelic haze. The characters are also pretty much always on the move, which makes the film feel like a really bad trip. It's legitimately anxiety-inducing. I do want to say that Mads is pretty slow to get going, though. I love a slow burn, but the characters here are really unlikable and kind of annoying, and because of how the film is shot and structured, they follow my least favorite character first. When chaos erupts, that doesn't really matter anymore, but if that sounds like it's going to annoy you, it probably will. Don't get me wrong, I am still a really big fan of Mads. Monolith feels like a spiritual successor to Pontypool. I've seen plenty of movies about podcasters, but few actually show them, podcasting. Most of this movie is Lily Sullivan sitting down in front of a microphone trying to unravel a conspiracy regarding mysterious black rocks. She's an investigative journalist, so pretty quickly she dismisses the story as nonsense, until she gets a phone call from a mysterious German art dealer who nudges her along. And it turns out the rabbit hole she jumps down here is deep and vast. One of the reasons I love horror so much is because you can do a lot with very little. As Lily Sullivan's character begins taking calls from people who've had experience with these black rocks, we are shown abstract images that correlates to the stories being told. The atmosphere is incredible, and it really sucks you in, even though there's really not a lot to it. It's just people talking to each other. That's why I compared it to Pontypool earlier. Where I think smaller films like this can stumble is in the third act, but luckily that doesn't happen here. They are smart enough to break away from the formula to change things up, and that leaves you with a satisfying conclusion. Monolith is a must-watch to me. And between Lily Sullivan's work here and in Evil Dead Rise, I think she's an actress to look out for. Trim season is a damn good time, and it's one of the biggest surprises of the year for me. I did not expect to like this movie at all, considering I heard people describe it as the killer weed movie. Now, the weed they are trimming in this movie is definitely fucked up and weird, but there's a lot more going on here. I was really impressed and delighted to see a movie with such an outlandish concept playing it straight. It feels more heartfelt than most movies with concepts like these that try to be so bad they're good on purpose. It turns out you can just make a good movie instead. Wild, I know. What I think really makes this movie work is its characters. They're all a bunch of young adults in a desperate need of money. Most of them are outcasts in one way or another, and the film takes a very sympathetic approach to them. We are joining them after they've made a pretty high-risk decision to go trim weed on top of this remote mountain. They'll be completely isolated from the outside world. Most of them don't even know each other, but just from a couple of conversations, you understand how they all got wrapped up in this. Young adults will disregard their own safety for a chance to get out of a tough situation, and there are those who will take advantage of that. So there's a human threat to this story that combines really well with the supernatural, which makes the entire movie feel rather helpless for the characters stuck on this mountain. I seem to rate this one a little bit higher than most people, though, so you might not like it as much as me. Nevertheless, I obviously think it's worth your time. Last Straw was exactly what I needed this year. After the abysmal The Strangers Chapter 1, I found myself longing for a good home invasion film, and a workplace invasion will work just as well. It doesn't feel like a ripoff of The Strangers, though, because the masks do come off eventually, and after that it turns into something completely different. This one gets pretty dark, and I was all here for it. What starts in a rural diner escalates to impact the entire town around it. The story is told from a couple of different characters, and each time we see something from a new perspective, the devastation feels much greater. The movie is set in one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone, so the ripple effects of the violence run deep. For as good as all this stuff is, I must admit that the film does have some pretty tired cliches in it. Nothing terrible, but characters do make some pretty illogical decisions at times. So while I wouldn't say this is one of the best films of the year, I think it's very underrated. I've barely heard anyone talk about it. Loop Track and Lowlifes are both cut from the same cloth, so I'm bundling them together for this part of the video. I sincerely think that both of these films are best experienced by knowing as little about them as possible. Out of the two, I definitely prefer Loop Track since it had my jaw on the floor in its third act. It has one of the wildest reveals I have ever seen in a horror movie. But when I said that the last time I talked about this movie, some people said I was overhyping it. That's why I want to be very clear about something here. Loop Track doesn't have a twist. It very clearly builds up to something. You just don't know what that is. And when the reveal happens, it's delightful. Lowlifes is kind of similar, but it twists and turns all throughout the runtime, which makes it incredibly difficult to talk about. It's yet another film set in rural America, but its approach is a bit different than the other ones I've talked about today. More so than anything, Lowlifes is about family and the lives we are born into. It's a film where the stereotypical hostile locals feel like more than just caricatures. I'll have more to say about this film and Loop Track at the end of the year, so for now, I think we should just move on. You can catch Lowlifes for free on Tubi, so if you want to watch it without being spoiled, I would suggest you do so before the end of the year. It's been a bit of a sleeper hit, so I think people are going to talk about it in their end-of-year recaps. Amber Alert has a bit of a weird legacy. It's technically a remake of a found footage film from 2012 by the same director. The original isn't very good, but it's actually the reason I decided to check out the remake. In fact, I would say the remake addresses my two main complaints with the original film. It didn't make any sense as a found footage movie, and the characters were awful. As you can tell, this one isn't found footage, and I'm happy to report that the characters are completely different. They also cast Hayden Panettiere as the lead, which honestly can get me to watch anything. The story is fairly simple. A woman and her Uber driver gets an Amber Alert on their phones and realize that the car in front of them is the one that the police are looking for. It's your standard cat and mouse thriller, but we see things from the cat's perspective here, as the mouse is the perpetrator. Other movies have done similar things, but I think the way it's handled here is really smart. You understand right away that the characters are going to get way in over their heads, and seeing that play out is really fun. There are things here that are silly, though, like obviously the police can never get physically involved, because at that point the movie would be over. There would be no reason for the characters to follow the car anymore. The plot kind of falls apart if you start thinking about it too much, and that's why I think it's probably the weakest movie on today's list. I was able to go along with it, though, and I had a lot of fun doing so. And this is kind of a side note, but I think it would make a great double feature with Brad Anderson's The Call. Blackout is the latest film from Larry Fessenden, and it's one of the films I thought most about this year. And I have to be honest here, the more I think about it, the more I like it. So it's kind of like the opposite of Amber Alert in that regard. There's something about the way Fessenden approaches his stories that is really appealing to me. Where they feel like classic horror stories, yet somehow incredibly modern. The only criticism I have here is that the script maybe has too many good ideas, making some of them feel not fully realized. There's clearly some Wolfman inspiration happening here, as we follow Charlie, a depressed alcoholic artist who's also a werewolf. All he wants to do is die, since he can no longer bear the guilt of hurting people, which he thinks he's been doing his entire life, even before he was bitten by a werewolf. It's sad and heavy, but also incredibly heartfelt as he begins to set his final plan into motion. He tries to make amends, catching up with people, and these segments play like short little vignettes. These are the last moments he has with these people, and what I think is so interesting is that the film never returns to them. There are exceptions to this, of course, but most characters and their struggles just fade into the background. The bittersweet part in all of this is that all of those side stories of small-town politics are also incredibly interesting. In any other movie, I would have complained about those plot threads ending without any resolution, but considering this is essentially a story about suicide, it feels incredibly fitting. I'm probably making Blackout seem like some emotional gut punch, but it's really not, honestly. See, on top of all of this sad stuff, you have a very gory werewolf B-movie filled with mayhem. It's such a wild juxtaposition to the otherwise serious tone, but it really works for me. And that's it. Those are the films that I wanted to recommend before making my big end-of-year video. That's going to come out in a couple of weeks. I have some time off in December to work on that, and that's going to be a little more freeform. I'm not going to read out a script for that one, I think. I'm going to make some talking points, and it's going to be a big, long ramble with trailer footage and all that. Subscribe if that's something you want to see. I'm also on TikTok. I deleted Twitter because that shit is a hellscape. I'm on Blue Sky. Now I'll leave a link to that. But more so than anything else, you should probably follow me on Letterboxd. That's where all the fun stuff happens. So yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for watching.